Chapter 50. Jim Barnette to the rescue. That's when Jim Barnette came and saved me one more time. I was in my office one Friday night getting ready for a show when Ralph Pulley, the ring announcer, popped his head in and said, "There's a guy named Jim Barnette at the back door, but security won't let him in." I jumped out of my chair and went to the back door. I thought it was a rib, but there was Jim just standing there. I admonished the people who wouldn't let him in by yelling, "When you see a man dressed like this, you don't stop him at the door. You bring him to my office." The security guard started in with, "Well, Ken Mantell said." "Forget what Ken Mantell said," I yelled. "This is Jim Barnette." I took Jim into my office, and since we hadn't seen each other in quite a while, we had a lot of catching up to do. I had last spoken with Jim about 8 months prior, because just after losing his job with the WWF, he tried to commit suicide. As soon as I heard that, I gave him a call and we had a long talk. He was really feeling very bad about himself, and I had to remind him, "Hey, you're Jim Barnette. You're a legend in this business, and you are a survivor. You're going to be just fine." I was so happy to see that he was doing great, and that he was now working for Jimmy Crockett. He then surprised me by telling me that Crockett had moved his headquarters from Charlotte to Dallas, in the same offices that Bill Watts had set up, and they even had Janie Engle as their secretary. Jim then asked me about the incident with the missing link, and I explained how I had been set up. Then, we spoke about my deal as booker for World Class, and how I owned 25% of the booking office. Jim wasn't impressed, and told me that 25% of the World Class booking office really didn't mean anything. He then told me that Crockett Promotions was expanding, and were planning on running in Texas on a regular basis. He suggested I set up a meeting with Jimmy Crockett and Dusty Rhodes to see if there was any possibility of me working for them. I didn't think much of his suggestion at the time, and instead, just enjoyed hanging out with him during the show. We went out to eat afterwards, and then I dropped him off at the corporate suite he was staying in. The next night, after driving back from our Saturday night show, Al Perez, Steve Harms, and I were talking in the parking lot of the Sportatorium, when Ken Mantell and Frank Dusek walked by. Steve looked at me and asked, "Gary, do you realize that your fate is in Ken Mantell's hands?" It's funny, but with all the signs pointing in the obvious direction, it wasn't until Steve asked me that question that I knew I had to take Jim Barnette up on his suggestion to meet with Jimmy and Dusty. It's said that the choices we make can alter our destiny, but I always go with that little thing inside my chest. I've always followed the little Gary Hart inside me, and I've never second-guessed him. That little street-smart boy from Halstead Street knew the difference from right and wrong, and at that very moment I knew that World Class was wrong for me. And by that time, it was obvious that there were other people interested in taking Texas. The WWF was clearly on the move, because in addition to running in Houston, they had slowly crept into West Texas, and according to Jim Barnette, Crockett Promotions had every intention of running in Texas, as well. I didn't take my decision to leave World Class lightly, and knew that if I set up the meeting with Jimmy and Dusty, it was a sure thing I was going to be hired. First of all, I was very close friends with both of them. Second of all, if they were planning on running shows in Texas, having Gary Hart on their roster would be a pretty big coup. I wasn't a Von Erich or Bruiser Brody, but I was a big name in Texas wrestling. I knew that by going to work for Jimmy Crockett I would be working opposition against the very wrestling office that I had been loyal to for so many years. I never in my whole career, ever, thought that I would work competition to Fritz in Dallas and Fort Worth. However, by 1988 I had no reservations about going in against him, because I knew that he was really losing interest in the wrestling business and not thinking clearly. Why else would he get in bed with characters like Ken Mantell and Sam Cohen? With that said, Fritz never thought, in his wildest imaginations, that I would ever up and leave him. Even if he thought I would, he never would have thought I would work against him. Fritz felt I was secure with him because I had 25% of the World Class booking office, and the last thing he ever thought would happen was that I would align myself with any other promotion and come back in against him. He truly never would have considered it. As far as he was concerned, I was home and had the booking job, had good insurance, had a nice percentage in the booking office, and that all our problems were in the past. There is not a doubt in my mind that Fritz felt that he and I were as snug as a bug in a rug, and that World Class was where I wanted to be. However, after Fritz refused to listen to me about Kerry, I knew I could do no more in World Class. Even though I cared a great deal about the promotion, and World Class was something very special to me, I could not stay and watch what I had worked so hard on for so many years deteriorate right in front of my eyes. After all the dysfunction with the heart attack angle, it was obvious the rest would be all downhill. Aside from the dysfunction, I had a different source of problems than I had during my last run as booker. I didn't have a Paul Bosch, Joe Blanchard or the Kozaks, I had Ken Mantell. He was all of them rolled into one, and I really didn't feel like dealing with him anymore. I strongly believe in fate and destiny, and I am grateful that Jim Barnette visited me when he did. The next day, I scheduled a meeting with Jimmy Crockett in Dusty Rhodes in their new Dallas office, and I brought Al Perez along with me, because I wanted him to meet them. They asked me if I was happy in world class, and I told them I wasn't. Then they asked me about the incident with the missing link. I guess when something like that happens, word really gets out. They probably heard that it was far worse, or that I had provoked it. So I assured them that I was set up, and did what I had to do to protect myself. After talking for a while, Dusty asked me point blank, "Do you want to be a part of Crockett Promotions?" I told them both that Al and I would love to be a part of it. Once we made our decision and received a starting date from Dusty, we had to decide what to do about Al being the world-class champion. Since only Al and I knew we were leaving, I booked a title match between Al and Kerry on TV. Without Kerry knowing, I told Al, when the time is right in the match, and Kerry is on top of you, hold him there so he can't get up. As soon as the referee counts you down, get up, shake Kerry's hand, and raise his arm. Al Perez lost the world title to Kerry Von Erich on March 6, 1988, and after their match, I got into the ring and hugged Kerry. That's how my final run in world class ended. I never gave notice and I never looked back. A few days later, my family boarded a train and we went to St. Louis in order to visit my brother. I thought taking a train would be a good thing, because we had never taken a train trip with the boys. From Fort Worth to St. Louis is not overly long, but it was nice enough that it was an exciting, good, fun time for the whole family. I left my wife and children with my brother for 2 weeks, and then flew down to Daytona Beach, where Kevin Sullivan and Sir Oliver Humperdinck had a condo. They invited me down and offered to help me find a place on the beach. I fell in love with Daytona and Kevin helped me find a first-floor condo overlooking the ocean. I got it for $500 a month, when it would usually cost $1,500 a month. Apparently, the woman who lived in it before hung herself from the ceiling fan, and nobody wanted to rent it because of that, so the rental price plummeted. Nothing like that bothers me, although I never told my family that story. When Al Perez and I left for the Carolinas, my 2 boys still weren't smart to wrestling. For a long time in world class, I had been managing Al and Abdullah the Butcher, and when I left with just Al, Jason and Chad got mad at me. They thought I had fired Abdullah and left him behind. They were angry for quite a while, until I explained that Abby was going to be in Japan. They truly adored Abdullah, and the feeling was mutual, because he was so good with my children. There could be a ton of people in the dressing room, but if I took them in and Abby was there, they would flock to him. They just loved being around him. He always had time for my sons, played cards with them, and showed them how to cheat. They also loved how he would eat his pizza after dipping it in milk. To this day they have very high regard for Abdullah the Butcher. One night at the reunion arena, Abdullah and Bruiser Brody had a really bloody, violent match, and Jason and Chad were standing in the hall where the wrestlers go to their dressing room. Abby and Brody were beating each other with chairs, and Jason freaked out, because he knew and loved both of them, and thought that they were fighting for real. He was carrying on in the dressing room, and Bruiser had to come in and say, "Jason, it's okay. It's me, Bruiser." Jason was still shaken up, but as soon as Abdullah came in and he saw the 2 of them laughing together, he calmed right down. I'm sure those instances were confusing for them, though. They would see Bruiser Brody beat up their daddy in the ring at night, and wake up the next morning to find Brody sleeping on the couch. Over time they came to understand that wrestling was manipulated, and eventually got smart on their own, but they didn't comprehend that in world class. When I would go into the back room with different guys to give out finishes, they would often ask me, "Dad, what are you doing when you take those guys into that little room over there?" It's funny, because whenever I would go pick them up at school or attend PTA meetings, all the kids thought it was super that Jason and Chad's dad was Gary Hart, but they never asked the obvious question, which is why my last name was Hart, while my children's last name was Williams. Of course, as my boys got older, they had their share of fistfight with bullies because their dad, the evil Gary Hart, but I taught them early on that if somebody punches them in the nose, kick him in the nuts. I told them that not because I was the evil Gary Hart, but just to let them know, you are a human being and deserve to be respected. If anyone tries to in any way intimidate you, don't strike first, but strike back hard. Wrestling was never discussed in my home, and my wife never for an instant tried to get involved in the business. If she ever saw me talking to anyone in the business, other than Jim Barnette, who she loved, she would walk away. Wrestling wives of my era were different, though. In my time you didn't smarten up anyone, especially your wife. If I smartened my wife up and she told another guy's wife what I told her, all the other wrestlers would find out, and then I would be in trouble. That's just the way it was back then. If my wife asked why I never won, I would just say there's more money in losing. She learned over time though and figured it out on her own. I mean, come on, my wife saw me sit down for dinner with Jack and Jerry Briscoe, while I was feuding with them in the Carolinas. However, she never got involved, and simply wasn't interested.